Sound of soft wind in the trees, distant birds chirping, the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. Look at the face of the old man resting in the afternoon sun. It is a portrait of perfect peace, a silence earned after a century of life. He is safe here. The war is a lifetime away. Sudden, deafening explosion of heavy artillery, followed immediately by the ripping canvas sound of an MG-42 machine gun and muffled screams. But close your eyes, and the sunlight vanishes. You are instantly transported to the frozen black void of the Ardennes forest in December 1944. Here, the darkness is not empty. It is hunting you. The German elite patrols are moving through the trees like wolves, convinced they own the night. But they are about to walk into a trap that shouldn't exist for another 30 years. The screen goes black. They didn't see the muzzle flash. They only felt the cold. You are about to witness the first true night vision duel in history. A secret showdown between a ghost with a rifle and the monsters in the dark dot to understand the sheer magnitude of the showdown that was about to unfold. You first have to understand the abyss into which the American forces had been thrown. By mid-December 1944, the Ardennes forest had ceased to be a geographical location and had become a frozen tomb. The temperature plummeted to record lows, turning the muddy ground into iron and the air into a biting physical assault that froze skin upon contact. For the American G is dug into the foxholes. The enemy wasn't just the Wehrmacht. It was the world itself. The fog was so thick it felt solid, a suffocating gray blanket that grounded the mighty Allied Air Force and blinded the forward artillery observers. The United States military, a machine built on the doctrine of overwhelming firepower and aerial superiority, had been effectively castrated by the weather. They were blind, frozen, and isolated in a landscape that swallowed sound and light. But the true terror didn't come from the cold. It came from the realization that while the Americans were blind, the enemy was not. The German counter-offensive, which would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, was spearheaded by troops who had been hardened on the Eastern Front. These were the Stoßtruppenschock, troops and elite Fallschirmjägers, who moved through the snow with the silence of predators. They wore white camouflage capes that rendered them invisible against the drifts, and they understood the psychology of the night. For years the Allies had owned the daylight, but in the Ardennes the sun set early, plunging the forest into 16 hours of pitch-black terror. During these long, freezing nights, the dynamic of the war inverted. The American soldiers huddled in their dugouts, terrified to light a cigarette for fear of a sniper's bullet, became the hunted. The forest around them came alive with sounds that might have been the wind or might have been the snapping of a twig under a jackboot. The psychological toll was devastating. Reports began to filter back to the command posts of sentries found dead in the morning with their throats cut, the snow around them undisturbed, as if they had been killed by ghosts. Patrols sent out to scout the perimeter simply vanished, swallowed by the white void. The American snipers, men trained to be the deadliest hunters on the battlefield, found themselves rendered impotent. A sniper relies on vision, on the ability to see further and clearer than his opponent. But in the heavy mist and the suffocating dark of the Ardennes, their scopes were useless glass tubes. They sat in their hides, shivering, gripping rifles they couldn't aim, listening to the movement of German patrols that they knew were out there, creeping closer, inch by inch. The frustration among the elite marksmen was palpable. They knew the Germans were probing the lines, looking for weak points to punch through with their panzer divisions. They knew that small, specialized German hunter-killer teams were operating in the no-man's land between the lines, dismantling American defenses one by one, but they were powerless to stop it. The doctrine of American warfare had no answer for an enemy that struck from the shadows and vanished before a flare could be fired. The confidence of the U.S. troops began to crack. They felt exposed, naked in the face of an invisible threat. It was a feeling of helplessness that permeated the ranks, from the shivering private in the foxhole to the officers huddled over maps in freezing command tents. In a command bunker near the Elsenborn Ridge, an American intelligence officer sat by the light of a flickering kerosene lamp, trying to make sense of the casualty reports piling up on his desk. The ink in his pen was sluggish from the cold. He looked at the reports of slashed tires, cut phone lines, and missing sentries. He realized that the Germans weren't just attacking. They were haunting them. They were winning the war for the night. With a shaking hand, he wrote an entry in his field diary that captured the terrifying reality of the situation. A sentence that would define the desperate need for a technological miracle. He wrote, "We own the day, but the day is short. In this forest we are prey, not hunters, as soon as the sun goes down." While the soldiers on the ground were fighting a war of attrition against the elements, a different kind of war was being fought in the shadowed laboratories of Berlin and the secret research facilities of the United States. It was a race to conquer the electromagnetic spectrum, a desperate scramble to give men the eyes of a predator. By late 1944, this technological arms race had birthed two distinct monsters, weapons that were years ahead of their time, yet tethered to the clumsy, heavy engineering of the 1940s. For the first time in military history, the stage was being set for a technological showdown that had never happened before. The Ardennes would not just be a battle of bullets. It would be the testing ground for the first generation of night vision, a confrontation where seeing the enemy meant radiating a signal that would get you killed. On the German side, the weapon was fearsome, a device that looked like it had been ripped from the pages of a science fiction pulp novel. It was codenamed Vampire, or technically the Zielgert 1229. The Germans had mounted this massive optical system onto the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle. The combination was terrifying in theory and brutal in practice. The STG-44 was already a weapon that terrified Allied troops with its rapid fire and intermediate cartridge. But with the Vampire attached, it became a Reaper of the Night. The system consisted of a large, heavy telescopic sight mounted on top of the receiver and a massive infrared searchlight mounted above that. To power this beast, the German night hunter had to carry a wooden case strapped to his back, housing a heavy gas mask canister battery and a secondary battery for the image converter. The soldier looked less like an infantryman and more like a cyborg, burdened by 30 pounds of volatile chemicals and glass. But the weight bought him a superpower. He could project a beam of invisible light that illuminated targets up to 200 yards away in total darkness. To the naked eye, the forest was black. To the Vampire, it was bathed in a ghostly, shimmering light. Across the lines, the Americans were not idle. They had developed their own answer to the problem of the dark, a device known as the M2, and later the improved M3 sniper scope. Unlike the Germans, who opted for the heavy firepower of an assault rifle, the Americans paired their technology with the lightweight, nimble M1 carbine. The American system was equally cumbersome, a chaotic assembly of a telescopic electronic tube and a large infrared emitter below the barrel. It was powered by a wet-cell lead-acid battery carried in a canvas rucksack, a heavy, sloshing brick of energy that was prone to leaking acid if hit by shrapnel. The American scope was fragile, relying on delicate vacuum tubes that could shatter with a hard impact, and the image it produced was a grainy, green-hued distortion that lacked depth perception. It required a marksman of immense skill to interpret the green blobs and static as human targets. It was a sniper's tool designed for precision, not the suppression fire of the German vampire. However, both of these technological marvels shared a fatal, terrifying flaw, a quirk of physics that turned the upcoming showdown into a game of Russian roulette. Both systems utilized active infrared. Modern night vision amplifies existing starlight, allowing the user to see passively. But in 1944, the technology couldn't do that. To see in the dark, the scopes needed a light source. The large lamps mounted on the rifles projected a beam of infrared light, invisible to the naked human eye, which the scopes then converted into a visible image. It was, in essence, a flashlight that only the user could see. But there was a catch. If two soldiers on opposite sides of the battlefield were both wearing night vision goggles, the invisible being was no longer invisible. If the American sniper turned on his scope to scan the trees, and a German vampire operator was looking in his direction, the American wouldn't just be visible. He would be a beacon. He would look like a man standing in a dark room holding a flare. The very technology designed to protect them became a target designator. It created a paradox of survival. To see the enemy, you had to reveal yourself. To stay hidden, you had to remain blind. This was the terrifying dynamic that was about to play out in the snow, a duel of discipline where the first man to switch on his light might be the first man to die. The stage was set for this collision of technologies on a Tuesday evening, just as the blizzard began to thicken. A supply truck, its wheels wrapped in chains to grip the ice, struggled up the logging road leading to the sector held by the American Elite Reconnaissance Unit. The truck didn't carry food or mail. It carried 3 heavy, nondescript wooden crates stenciled with the warning, "Top secret, handle with care." There were no instruction manuals inside, just the heavy smell of grease, canvas, and ozone. The unit commander called for his best marksman, a man who had grown tired of being blind in the night. As the crates were pried open with a crowbar, revealing the strange alien shapes of the infrared scopes and the heavy battery packs, the sniper didn't feel like he was being given a weapon. He felt like he was being handed a curse. He looked at the glass eye of the scope, dark and cold, and realized that the war had just changed. The darkness was no longer a shield. It was an arena. The man chosen to wield this clumsy lightning was not a scientist, nor was he a product of the pristine military academies back in the States. Sergeant Silas Vance was a ghost long before the Army handed him an infrared scope. Raised in the jagged, unforgiving high country of the Smoky Mountains, Vance had learned the art of stillness before he learned to read. He was a hunter of the old world, a man who understood that patience was a weapon far deadlier than gunpowder. In the daylight of the Ardennes, he was lethal, a precise instrument that could thread a bullet through a gap in the trees at 600 yards. But the Ardennes winter had stripped him of his greatest asset, his vision. For weeks, Vance had sat in his foxhole, shivering and impotent, listening to the German patrols dismantle his unit piece by piece in the dark. He hated the helplessness more than he hated the cold. When the supply truck dropped off the secret crates, Vance didn't look at the equipment with awe. He looked at it with the critical, cynical eye of a craftsman inspecting a flawed tool. He pulled the M3 sniper scope from its straw packing and immediately identified the problem that the engineers in the warm laboratories of New Jersey had missed. The weapon was a marvel of electronics, but a disaster of ergonomics. It was top-heavy, fragile, and tethered to a lead-acid battery pack that weighed as much as a mortar shell. Vance sat in the corner of a bombed-out cellar that served as the platoon's forward post, running his calloused hands over the freezing rubber cables. He knew the chemistry of lead-acid batteries. He knew that in the 20 below zero temperatures of the forest, the liquid electrolyte inside that heavy canvas backpack would turn into slush. The battery wouldn't just fail. It would freeze and crack, leaking corrosive acid down the back of his jacket. The secret weapon was a paperweight waiting to happen. If he took this out into the snow as it was, he would be dead in an hour. Vance decided that if he was going to fight Ghost, he needed to stop following the manual. He pushed the standard-issue battery aside. It was trash. Instead, he went scavenging. He found a destroyed radio jeep near the perimeter, its chassis twisted by artillery, but its electrical guts intact. He pulled the heavy-duty dry-cell batteries from the radio housing. These were ugly, blocky things, but they didn't freeze. They held a charge that was raw and aggressive. Back in the cellar, under the light of a single flickering candle, Vance began his surgery. He stripped the insulation off the scope's power cable, using his trench knife, exposing the copper veins. He didn't have soldering irons or connectors. He used friction tape and sheer force of will. He wired the dry cells in a series that he hoped wouldn't blow the delicate vacuum tubes in the scope. He created a longer, improvised umbilical cord of wire, allowing him to keep the battery pack inside his coat against his body heat, rather than exposed to the freezing air. It was a Frankenstein modification, a jagged scar of black tape and exposed wire that would have horrified a safety inspector, but Vance wasn't trying to pass an inspection. He was trying to keep the lights on. The first time he flipped the switch, the weapon hummed with a terrifying, high-pitched whine, like a mosquito trapped in a bottle. Vance pressed his eye to the rubber cup. He didn't see the crisp, clear world he was used to. He saw an electronic purgatory. The view through the M3 was a grainy, swimming tunnel of nauseating green light. The resolution was terrible. There was no depth perception. Trees 10 yards away looked the same size as trees 50 yards away. The image smeared when he moved the rifle too fast, leaving trails of ghostly light that confused the eye. It wasn't like aiming a rifle. It was like aiming a camera underwater in a swamp. Most soldiers would have given up, claiming it was impossible to shoot accurately. Vance just grunted. He spent the next 3 hours in that cellar, training his brain to interpret the green static. He learned that the brighter blobs were heat-living things, and the black voids were cold stone or metal. He learned to shoot not at a silhouette, but at the center of the glow. He adjusted his breathing to sync with the pulses of the unstable battery. He was adapting, evolving from a visual hunter to a thermal one. By the time twilight settled over the Ardennes, turning the snow from white to a deep, bruising blue, Vance was ready. The orders from the lieutenant were clear. Hold the line, stay in the foxholes. Do not engage unless engaged. The command was terrified of friendly fire in the confusion of the dark. But Vance knew that staying in the hole was a death sentence. The German patrols were already moving. He could feel them. He strapped the heavy, taped-up battery pack to his chest, under his parka, feeling the hum of the dry cells against his ribs. He picked up the modified carbine, the heavy scope throwing off the balance, making it feel alien in his hands. He didn't ask for permission. He waited until the lieutenant was distracted by the radio, and then he slipped over the sandbags. He moved into the no man's land, a solitary figure dissolving into the shadows. He wasn't a soldier defending a position anymore. He was a predator entering a new ecosystem. The cold wind bit at his exposed face, but he didn't feel it. He flipped the switch on the battery. The whine started. The green eye opened, and Sergeant Silas Vance stepped into a world where he was the only thing that could see. Vance positioned himself in the hollow of a frozen creek bed, a natural trench carved by centuries of water that was now solid ice. He was 300 yards forward of the American perimeter, deep in the kill zone that the Germans had been exploiting for weeks. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against his eardrums. In any other war, in any other battle, this position would have been suicide. To sit alone in no man's land without a spotter, without radio contact, and without visibility was a death sentence. But Vance wasn't alone. He had the humming box of chemicals strapped to his chest, and he had the green eye. He rested the heavy fore-end of the carbine on a snow-covered root, checking the connections of his jury-rigged wiring one last time. The dry cell batteries were warm against his ribs, a stark contrast to the biting wind that numbed his exposed cheeks. He flicked the switch. The high-pitched whine of the capacitors filled his ears, a sound he prayed the wind would carry away from the enemy. He pressed his eye to the scope. The world turned green. It was a nauseating, grainy green, swimming with static and distortion, but it was a revelation. The trees, which were invisible black shapes to the naked eye, stood out like gray skeletons against the glowing snow. And then he saw them. They emerged from the tree line like specters, moving with a terrifying arrogance. It was a standard German probing patrol, 7 men, heavily armed, moving in a loose wedge formation. They were loud. Vance could hear the crunch of their boots on the crusty snow and the metallic clink of their equipment. They weren't trying to be quiet because they believed, with the absolute certainty of experience, that no American soldier would be foolish enough to be out this far in the dark. Through the electronic lens of the M3 scope, they were glowing. The infrared beam projected by Vance's rifle reflected off their uniforms and gear, painting them in a ghostly luminescence. They looked like spirits traversing the underworld, unaware that Karen was waiting for them behind a tree root. Vance didn't pull the trigger immediately. He let the hunter take over. He scanned the formation, fighting the urge to shoot the point man. He looked for the antenna. There the third man back, the radio operator. If he let that man live, he would call down mortar fire on the whole grid. Vance shifted his aim. The crosshair was a black smear in the green soup, hovering over the radio operator's chest. Vance exhaled, watching his breath bloom in the scope, and squeezed. The carbine coughed, a sharp, dry crack that was instantly muffled by the dense pine forest. The radio operator didn't scream. He just folded. The heavy radio on his back dragged him down into the snow as if a giant hand had swatted him from the earth. The reaction of the German patrol was textbook, and under normal circumstances it would have saved them. They instantly dropped to the prone position, their weapons raised, scanning for the muzzle flash. They shouted commands, waiting for the follow-up shots to reveal the enemy's position. But there was no flash. Vance had wrapped a burlap sack loosely around the flash hider, dispersing the gas, and the distance swallowed the spark. To the Germans, their comrade had simply dropped dead from a heart attack. They lay in the snow, straining their eyes into the darkness, seeing absolutely nothing. They were staring into a void. Vance cycled the bolt, the brass casing ejecting silently into the soft snow next to him. He shifted the crosshair to the man who was shouting orders, the officer. The man was kneeling behind a sapling, thinking he was covered. In the visible spectrum, he was hidden by shadows. In the infrared spectrum, he was lit up like a stage actor. Vance fired again. The officer's head snapped back, and the shouting stopped. Now, discipline collapsed into panic. The remaining 5 Germans realized they were being dissected by an invisible force. They did the only thing they could do. They opened fire on the night. One machine gunner depressed the trigger of his MG-42, sawing a line of tracer fire into the trees. It was a fatal mistake. The bright, burning magnesium of the tracers didn't hit Vance, but it blinded the Germans, ruining their natural night vision. More importantly, the muzzle flashes acted as beacons. Vance didn't even need the infrared scope to see where they were now. They were painting targets on their own chest. He worked the bolt with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Crack! The machine gunner slumped over his weapon. Crack! A rifleman trying to crawl backward was pinned to the earth. The valley floor became a theater of confusion. The Germans were screaming, "Wo sind sie? Where are they?" Throwing grenades at random trees, fighting a phantom that refused to materialize. Vance felt a cold detachment. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The improvised battery pack was holding strong, the voltage consistent, keeping the green eye open while the Germans died in the dark. He watched them scramble, slip, and fall. He saw the terror in their body language, the way they huddled together, seeking comfort in proximity, which only made them a bigger target. He took down 2 more, leaving only 1 man, a young soldier, who had dropped his rifle and was scrambling on all 4s through the deep snow, hyperventilating in terror. Vance lowered the rifle. He watched the survivor run. He watched him stumble, get up, and sprint back toward the German lines, disappearing into the green static of the distance. Vance could have taken the shot. It would have been easy, but he let him go. He needed a messenger. He needed that boy to get back to the German command bunker, shaking and pale, and tell the officers that the Americans weren't blind anymore. He needed him to describe the impossible accuracy, the lack of flares, the silence of the death that had come for them. As the survivor vanished, Vance switched off the battery. The whining noise died. The green world collapsed back into oppressive, heavy blackness. He was alone again in the cold, but the dynamic had shifted forever. He crawled backward out of the creek bed, dragging his rifle, leaving the bodies of the patrol to freeze in the snow. The message had been sent. The Americans had opened their eyes, and they were the eyes of a demon. The survivor did exactly what Vance had hoped, but the result was not the superstitious panic the American sniper had anticipated. Instead, it triggered a cold, mechanical response from the German high command. The young soldier, frostbitten and raving about phantom lights and silent death, was dragged into a fortified bunker deep behind the German lines. He was thrown before an Oberst who did not believe in ghosts. The colonel listened to the description of the green glow and the precision fire in total darkness. He didn't hear a ghost story. He heard a technical specification. Germany had been developing infrared technology for years, primarily for tanks and specialized sniper units. The colonel realized with a jolt of grim clarity that the Americans had cracked the code. They had brought their own magic to the forest. He turned to his aide and issued a single classified order: deploy the Nachtjäger, the vampire squad. 2 hours later, a half-track rumbled up to the front line, offloading a squad of men who moved with the heavy, deliberate gait of deep-sea divers. These were not the conscripts or the shivering infantry. These were specialists. Strapped to their backs were massive wooden crates housing gas mask canister batteries. In their hands they held the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first assault rifle. But these rifles were mutated. Mounted on top were the enormous ZG-1229 vampire scopes, topped with huge infrared searchlights. They looked like monsters from a future war, hulking silhouettes burdened by 30 pounds of glass and chemicals. Their mission was simple: hunt the hunter. They moved into the forest not to capture territory, but to kill the anomaly that was bleeding their patrols dry. Out in the no man's land, Sergeant Vance felt the shift in the atmosphere before he saw it. The woods felt different. The usual careless noise of the German patrols, the snapping twigs, the whispered complaints about the cold was gone. The silence was heavy, predatory. Vance lay in the snow, his jury-rigged battery pack humming against his chest, but he hesitated to flip the switch. A terrible realization had begun to dawn on him, a fundamental law of physics that turned his greatest advantage into his greatest liability. The M3 sniper scope, like the German vampire, was an active infrared system. It didn't just see in the dark. It projected a beam of light that was invisible to the naked eye, but blindingly bright to anyone else looking through an infrared scope. If the Germans had their own night vision, then turning on his scope was the equivalent of standing in a dark room and lighting a flare. He wouldn't be the invisible man anymore. He would be a lighthouse. This was the new game. It was Russian roulette played with light switches. If Vance turned on his scope to scan for targets, and a German sniper was already looking in his direction, Vance would be dead before his eyes could focus on the green screen. He had to be smarter. He had to play a game of bait and switch. He reached into his pack and pulled out a spare infrared emitter he had scavenged from the broken equipment. It was just the lamp, wired to a smaller dying battery. He crawled 20 yards to his left, dragging his body through the snow with agonizing slowness, and propped the spare lamp in the fork of a tree branch facing the German lines. He wired it up, taped the switch to the on position, and then scrambled back to his original position, burying himself deep in a drift behind a thick oak trunk. He waited. He didn't turn on his own scope. He lay in the freezing dark, listening. Minutes passed. The cold seeped into his bones. Then he heard it not a footstep, but a sound that only he would recognize. The high-pitched mosquito whine of capacitors charging. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of his own technology, but it wasn't coming from his chest. It was coming from the darkness ahead. The Germans were out there, and they had turned their eyes on. Vance took a deep breath, his heart hammering against the battery pack. He looked toward his decoy lamp. To his naked eye it was dark, but to the Germans it would look like a sniper carelessly scanning the woods. Suddenly the tree branch holding the decoy exploded. A burst of automatic fire tore through the wood, shredding the lamp. The sound of the STG-44 was unmistakable, a rapid, guttural burst that echoed through the valley. They had taken the bait. They had fired at the lighthouse. Now, while they were distracted, while they thought they had killed the ghost, Vance made his move. He flipped the switch on his own chest. The whine started. He brought the carbine up. The green world flooded his vision. He didn't look at the decimated tree branch. He looked back along the trajectory of the bullets. He scanned the darkness, sweeping the heavy rifle through the static and the grain. And then he froze. There, 70 yards away, crouching by a cluster of rocks, he saw it. It wasn't a man's body he saw first. It was a light, a bright, burning orb of white light floating in the green darkness. It wasn't a reflection. It was a source. It was the infrared emitter of a vampire scope, looking straight ahead. And behind that light, glowing faintly in the thermal wash, was the face of a German soldier. Vance was staring down the barrel of the enemy's technology. He wasn't looking at a soldier. He was looking at his mirror image. The German was scanning the area where the decoy had been destroyed, checking for a kill. He hadn't seen Vance yet, but he was swinging his rifle. The massive eye of the vampire scope was rotating, inch by inch, toward Vance's position. The showdown had begun. It was no longer a hunt. It was a duel of ghosts, and the first man to blink would die. The confrontation in the valley had devolved into a gladiatorial arena, where the rules of conventional warfare no longer applied. It was a duel fought in a spectrum of light that didn't exist for 99% of the human race. Vance stared through his grainy, pulsating green scope at the bright white orb of the German vampire operator 70 yards away. The German was sweeping his rifle, the massive searchlight mounted on top, casting a beam that was invisible to the naked eye but blindingly bright in the infrared. Vance realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he held a singular, reckless advantage. The German equipment was factory standard, running on a regulated 6-volt system designed for stability. Vance's equipment was a Frankenstein monster, powered by heavy-duty radio dry cells wired in a series that was pumping nearly double the intended voltage into his emitter. He wasn't just holding a flashlight, he was holding a supernova. Vance didn't try to hide. He did the opposite. He aimed his rifle directly at the German's scope. In the physics of active infrared, this was an aggressive move. The sheer intensity of Vance's overclocked beam hit the German's optical sensor with overwhelming force. Inside the German's headset, the image didn't just get brighter. It bloomed into a total whiteout. The sensitive cathode tube in the vampire system was instantly saturated, blinding the operator with a wall of pure, featureless light. Vance saw the German soldier flinch, saw him rip his head away from the scope, clawing at his eyes as if he had looked into the sun. That split second of sensory overload was all Vance needed. He settled his crosshair on the center of the flinching thermal blob. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the freezing air. The German operator collapsed, his heavy vampire unit smashing into the rocks, but the element of surprise was gone. The valley floor erupted. 2 more beams of infrared light swung wildly from the tree line. The rest of the vampire squad. They had seen the muzzle flash, or at least the thermal bloom of the discharge. They opened fire. Green tracers from the Sturm Gauer 44s tore through the darkness, seeking Vance's position. But Vance was already moving. He knew that in a sniper duel, stationarity was death. He scrambled to his left, dragging the heavy battery umbilical cord through the snow, burying himself behind the thick trunk of a fallen pine. The Germans were panicking. They were spraying the woods, sweeping their massive searchlights back and forth. To Vance, looking through his scope, it looked like a laser show in a horror movie. Beams of light crossed and slashed through the green static. But Vance noticed something critical. The German beams were dimming. The extreme cold of the Ardennes was sapping the life out of their gas mask batteries. Their light was yellowing, fading at the edges. Vance's dry cell rig, however, was burning hot against his chest. It was unstable, dangerous, and smelling of melting insulation, but it was powerful. He had the reach. He could see them before they could see him. He popped up from behind the log. He found the second vampire operator, who was frantically scanning the wrong patch of trees. The German's light was weak, barely illuminating the snow 10 yards in front of him. Vance, on the other hand, lit the man up like a Christmas tree. The range was closing 60 yards. Vance fired. The bullet took the German in the shoulder, spinning him around. The heavy vampire rifle flew from his hands, landing in a snowdrift where the emitter continued to shine a useless beam at the sky. The last remaining member of the German elite squad realized the tactical disadvantage. He couldn't outshoot the ghost in the trees, so he decided to rush him. He abandoned the sniper tactics and charged, firing his assault rifle from the hip, using the infrared beam to illuminate his path. It was a terrifying sight, a hulking silhouette charging through the green haze, muzzle flashes blooming like white flowers. Vance tracked him. The vibration of the battery pack against his ribs was becoming violent. The whine of the capacitors was screaming now, a warning that the system was about to fail catastrophically. The image in Vance's scope began to tear, horizontal lines of static obliterating the view for seconds at a time. He had one shot left in the magazine. The German was 30 yards away, 20. Vance could see the steam rising from the German's mouth. He could see the wild desperation in his eyes through the magnified lens. The German raised his rifle to spray Vance's position. Vance held his breath, ignoring the burning heat on his chest, ignoring the flickering scope. He waited for the image to stabilize for a fraction of a second. The static cleared. The crosshair settled on the center of the charging mass. Vance fired. The German's momentum carried him forward another 2 steps before his legs gave out. He face-planted into the snow, sliding to a halt just 10 yards from Vance's position. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The assault rifle fire stopped. The shouting stopped. The only sound was the jagged, dying whine of Vance's battery pack. He reached down and flipped the switch. The green world collapsed into black. The smell of ozone and burnt hair hung heavy in the air. Vance sat back against the pine tree, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped the rifle. He sat in the pitch black, listening to the wind reclaim the valley. The vampire squad, the technological terror of the Third Reich, lay dead in the snow, defeated not by superior German engineering, but by American grit and a battery rigged with friction tape. The showdown was over. The valley was quiet, and in the dark the cold began to settle over the bodies of the men who had tried to steal the night. Dawn broke over the Ardennes with a reluctant gray light, revealing the carnage of the valley floor. But before the sun could fully illuminate the twisted metal of the German vampire scopes and the bodies of the elite squad, the roar of American jeeps shattered the morning silence. These weren't the standard supply trucks or the medics coming to tend the wounded. These were intelligence officers and military police, men who moved with a frantic, nervous energy. They didn't care about the frozen corpses of the German infantry. They stepped right over them. Their target was the technology. They scrambled over the rocks, wrestling the heavy Sturmgewehr rifles with their shattered infrared searchlights from the stiff grips of the dead Germans. These were trophies of the highest order proof of Nazi engineering that the Allied command was desperate to analyze and suppress. Simultaneously, 2 MPs approached Sergeant Vance. He was still sitting by the pine tree, shivering as the adrenaline crashed out of his system. Staring at the smoking ruin of his improvised battery pack, they didn't pat him on the back. They didn't offer him a medal for stopping the breakthrough. They stripped him of his gear. They took the M3 sniper scope, the modified carbine, and the charred remains of the dry cell rig. They bagged it all in heavy canvas sacks marked classified. An officer with a clipboard leaned in close to Vance, his breath visible in the cold air. "You were never here, Sergeant," he said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "You didn't see green lights. You didn't see scope-mounted searchlights. This was a standard infantry engagement repelled by small arms fire. If you speak about the electronics, you will be court-martialed for discussing state secret. Do you understand?" Vance nodded slowly. He watched as the jeeps sped away, carrying the evidence of the future of warfare back to a dark room in Washington or London. The battle was erased before the bodies were even cold. The official reports filed that week described a skirmish with a German reconnaissance element. There was no mention of infrared. There was no mention of the duel in the dark. As the Cold War loomed on the horizon, neither the Americans nor the Soviets wanted to admit that the age of night warfare had arrived so messy and unregulated. The M3 scopes were crated up and sent to warehouses to collect dust, awaiting the next war in Korea. The vampire units disappeared into the bowels of eyed intelligence for reverse engineering. The showdown in the Ardennes became a ghost story, a rumor whispered between veterans who were told they were hallucinating from fatigue. The scene dissolves. The white snow of 1944 melts away, replaced by the warm golden hue of a Georgia afternoon. We are back on the porch. The old man, the veteran with the lined face and the clouded eyes, opens them slowly. The sound of the artillery is gone, replaced once again by the gentle rustle of the wind in the oak trees. He takes a breath, and for a moment he doesn't feel the warmth of the sun. He feels the phantom weight of a battery pack burning against his chest. He looks out at the peaceful street, but he knows what lies beneath the surface of the world. He knows that safety is an illusion maintained by men willing to do terrible things in the dark. He survived not because he was stronger and not because he was faster. He survived because for one brief, terrifying night, he saw the invisible. He closes his eyes again, a small, secret smile playing on his lips. The world thinks he is just an old man dreaming of the past. They don't know that he is the keeper of the first flame that lit up the modern battlefield. History is written in the daylight, recorded in books and etched onto monuments. But the truth is often hidden in the shadows, classified, buried, and forgotten. The duel in the Ardennes was just one of thousands of moments where the course of history hung by a thread or a wire that no one was allowed to see. If you want to uncover more of these lost chapters, if you want to see the wars that were fought off the books and out of sight, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel. Join us as we peel back the layers of redaction and silence, because while the history books tell you who won, we are here to tell you how it really happened. The water was red, the snow was white, but the truth is always in the dark.